Before the clock, nobody knew exactly what time it was. The sun rose, people worked. The sun set, people slept. An hour could be longer in summer than in winter, and no one thought that was strange. Then someone built a machine that refused to guess. For the first time in history, time could be counted, divided, and controlled with perfect regularity. That simple invention transformed cities, powered factories, guided ships across oceans, and eventually began governing every moment of our lives. So how did a machine, built to measure time, end up ruling it? This is the history of the clock. Strasbourg, 1354. A crowd of several hundred people stands in the cathedral square and stares upward at something nobody in the world has seen before. A mechanical rooster, made of iron, opens its beak and crows. A small metal angel tips an hourglass. A procession of figures revolves in a slow circle, and above them all, a bell strikes the hour, not because a monk pulled a rope, but because a machine decided it was time. The Strasbourg Cathedral clock was among the first public mechanical clocks in Europe. People walked for days to see it. And what stunned them was not the engineering. What stunned them was the idea. That time, something they had always understood as a gift of the sun and the turning seasons, belonging to God, belonging to nature, could be measured, divided, and announced by a machine made of iron and falling weights. That is where our story begins. Time, before the clock, was not a number. It was a texture. The sun rose, and people woke. It set, and they slept. The seasons turned, and crops were planted or harvested. There was a loose rhythm to the day, organized around the church bell and the angle of the sun, but nothing that resembled precision. In medieval Europe, an hour was not 60 minutes. It was 1/12 of the daylight period, which meant it stretched to 80 minutes in summer and shrank to 40 in winter. Two people in different towns saying the third hour were not describing the same moment. Time was local, seasonal, approximate, and nobody found this troubling because nobody had experienced anything different. The oldest time-measuring instruments on record are not machines. They are shadows. The gnomon, a vertical post placed in the ground, casts a shadow that moves as the sun moves across the sky. Ancient Egyptians formalized this into the sundial, a carefully calibrated instrument that divided the day into segments by tracking the shadow's position against marked surfaces. Egyptian shadow clocks appear in records dating to approximately 1500 BCE. But they had an obvious limitation. They required sunlight. At night, in winter, in cloudy weather, behind walls, the shadow vanished, and the time went with it. The water clock, the clepsydra, meaning water thief in Greek, solved the problem of darkness. Water flows through an opening at a rate determined by the size of the hole and the pressure of the water above. Measure how much water has passed from one vessel to another, and you have measured the passage of time. Clepsydrae appeared independently in ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, China, India, and Greece. One of those inventions that many civilizations discovered separately because the problem they solve is universal. Ctesibius of Alexandria, working around 250 BCE, built the most sophisticated clepsydra of antiquity. He was an engineer of remarkable originality who also invented the force pump and the pipe organ. His water clock used a float mechanism to maintain constant water pressure and drove a rotating drum marked with time notations through a gear system. To all practical intents, Ctesibius built a clock, but it lived in the royal court of Alexandria. Ordinary people continued to tell time by the sun and the bell. So why did it take another 1,000 years before the mechanical clock appeared? Because ordinary people, living in agrarian villages, organized around natural rhythms, had no use for it. If you are weeding a field or tending sheep, knowing whether it is the second or third hour of the afternoon changes nothing about your work. The mechanical clock was not absent from medieval life because engineering knowledge was lacking. It was absent because no constituency demanded precision time. The constituency arrived when the city did. Between 1000 and 1300 CE, European urban populations grew at rates not seen since the fall of Rome. Florence grew from a modest town to a city approaching 100,000 inhabitants. London, Paris, Bruges, and Cologne expanded rapidly. Markets multiplied. Long-distance trade created commercial relationships between people who had never met, in cities far apart, operating on schedules specified in advance in written contracts. For the first time in European history, large numbers of people needed to be in a particular place at a particular hour, and they needed everyone involved to agree on what that hour was. The first mechanical clocks appeared in European monasteries in the late 13th century, but their initial function was liturgical, not commercial. Benedictine monks were required to pray at 8 canonical hours spread through the day and night, including matins at roughly 2 or 3 in the morning. Maintaining this schedule required someone to stay awake watching a candle burn or a water clock drain, then wake the community at the correct moment. The mechanical clock, with its escapement mechanism that released a hammer on a bell at fixed intervals, automated this task. The first mechanical clock was an alarm. It did not show the time. It announced it. The oldest surviving mechanical clock in England stands in Salisbury Cathedral, built around 1386. It has no face and no hands. It is a skeletal assembly of iron bars, toothed wheels, and a folioed balance, and it still works today. Standing before it is a strange experience. But what it accomplished was profound. A machine, not a person, not the sun, was now keeping time. The responsibility had passed from nature to engineering. That transfer of responsibility was one of the most consequential events in human history, and it happened so quietly that almost nobody noticed. The key to the mechanical clock's operation is the escapement. Without it, a falling weight drives a gear train at whatever uncontrolled speed the weight's mass dictates. The escapement interrupts the motion. It catches each gear tooth, holds it, and releases it in a controlled sequence. Each release is one tick. The energy of the falling weight is rationed into equal, countable pulses. The escapement is what makes the clock tick rather than spin. It is what makes time divisible into measurable units. Early escapements were imprecise. A 14th century tower clock might gain or lose 15 minutes per day, adequate for ringing the prayer bell, useless for anything more exacting. The transformative improvement arrived in 1657, when Christian Huygens, the Dutch mathematician and physicist, patented the pendulum clock. A pendulum has a natural period determined entirely by its length. A pendulum of fixed length will always complete one swing in the same time, regardless of how hard it is pushed. This property, called isochronism, gave Huygens something no previous clockmaker had possessed: a regulator independent of friction, temperature variation, and mechanical inconsistency. His first pendulum clock was accurate to within 1 minute per day. By the following decade, improved designs brought this to under 10 seconds per day. For the first time in recorded history, time was truly reliable. The marine chronometer applied this reliability to the ocean, with world-altering consequences. Navigators had been able to determine their north-south latitude for centuries by measuring the sun's angle at noon. Determining east-west longitude required knowing the precise time at a fixed reference location while simultaneously reading the local time from the sun. The difference, converted to degrees, gave the ship's position. The problem was that no clock could maintain accuracy at sea. The rolling of the ship disturbed the pendulum, Changes in temperature caused metal components to expand and contract. Ships drifted off course. Sailors died. Governments offered enormous prizes for a solution. John Harrison, an English clockmaker largely self-taught, who had begun his career building clocks from wood, spent 4 decades on the problem. His fourth marine timekeeper, the H4, completed in 1759, maintained accuracy to within 5 seconds over an 81-day voyage from England to Jamaica. The longitude prize, worth the modern equivalent of several $1,000,000, had stood unclaimed for decades. Harrison's clock claimed it, and in claiming it, it made precision ocean navigation possible for the first time in history, reshaping global trade routes, enabling colonial expansion, and determining which nations would dominate the world's oceans for the following century and a half. The railroad created the final pre-digital crisis of timekeeping. Before railways, each town in England kept its own local time based on the sun's position at that town's longitude. Bristol's noon was 10 minutes behind London's. This was irrelevant when travel between cities took days by coach. It became dangerous when it took hours by train, 2 trains sharing the same track but running on different local times created scheduling ambiguities that caused collisions. In 1840, the Great Western Railway became the first company to adopt standardized time across its entire network. By 1855, 98% of British towns had adopted Greenwich time. In 1880, Greenwich Mean Time was legally standardized across Britain by an Act of Parliament. Local time, which had varied for all of recorded history, was abolished. The clock had not just measured time, it had unified it. The United States formalized 4 separate time zones in 1883, driven by the railways. Before standardization, American railroad schedules listed over 300 distinct local times across the country. What had been a mechanical curiosity in Strasbourg in 1354 was, by 1883, the legal framework organizing an entire continent's economic activity. The quartz watch arrived in 1969 with the Seiko Quartz Astron, the world's first commercially available quartz wristwatch, sold in Japan for a price equivalent to a small car. Quartz watches use a piezoelectric crystal that vibrates at precisely 32,768 times per second when an electric current is applied, making them accurate to within 15 seconds per month, far beyond any mechanical watch of the previous century. Within a decade, quartz movements had made mechanical watches economically non-competitive for practical timekeeping. The Swiss watch industry lost 2/3 of its workforce between 1970 and 1983, a period the industry calls the Quartz Crisis. Time had, once again, transformed an entire economy overnight. The digital clock completed a visual transformation with deeper consequences than it appears. Where mechanical and quartz clocks showed time as a position on a circular dial, a spatial, cyclical representation, the digital display presents time as a number. 1437. A clock face shows you where you are in the day's cycle. A digital number shows you a quantity. The digital clock completed the transformation of time from a flow experienced in the body to a score tracked by a device. The Industrial Revolution weaponized the clock. The factory system required synchronization that agriculture had never demanded. Factory machines ran on schedules. Shift changes happened at specific moments that could not be moved without consequences through the production line. Factory owners installed clock towers over the factory gate and began docking wages for workers who arrived late. Parliamentary legislation set the legal length of the working day in hours. Time, previously experienced as a natural phenomenon, had been converted into a unit of economic exchange. The British historian E.P. Thompson documented this transformation in his landmark 1967 essay, Time, Work Discipline, and industrial capitalism, arguing that one of the most profound cultural shifts of the industrial era was the replacement of task orientation with time orientation. Before factories, a craftsman finished a piece of work, and that was the day's labor. The output defined the workday. After factories, a worker sold a fixed number of hours, and whatever was produced in those hours belonged to the employer. The clock did not just measure the workday. It created it as a commercial transaction. Mass-produced pocket watches, available to ordinary working people by the 1870s through American manufacturers applying factory techniques to precision watchmaking, completed the privatization of time. The clock moved off the factory tower and onto the body. You now carried your own countdown everywhere you went. Punctuality, arriving at the exact correct moment, became a moral virtue in industrial culture in a way it had never been before, because tardiness now had a measurable, contractual cost. The wristwatch arrived from the trenches of the First World War. Soldiers synchronizing the timing of infantry advances with artillery bombardments needed to check the time while keeping their bodies pressed low against the mud of the trench. Raising a hand to check a pocket watch exposed the arm above the parapet, a gesture that could invite a sniper's shot. The wristwatch solved the problem. Military procurement drove mass production. Returning soldiers wore their wristwatches home. By the 1930s, the pocket watch was obsolete. The atomic clock arrived in 1955, built by Louis Essen and Jack Perry at the National Physical Laboratory in England. It uses the vibrations of cesium-133 atoms as its timekeeping mechanism. These atoms oscillate at precisely 9,192,631,770 cycles per second, always, everywhere, unaffected by temperature, pressure, or the passage of time. The cesium atomic clock loses or gains 1 second every 300 million years. This precision serves no individual human purpose. It is required by GPS satellites, financial trading systems, and global communications infrastructure. Modern civilization runs on atomic time, invisibly, beneath every device and every transaction. And yet, despite this precision, or because of it, research consistently finds that people in heavily clocked, digitally scheduled societies feel more rushed and less in control of their time than people in any previous era. A 2012 American Psychological Association survey found that time pressure ranked among the top reported causes of chronic stress. We have never measured time more accurately. We have rarely felt more controlled by it. The crowd in Strasbourg in 1354 gathered to see a marvel. They did not see a cage. We have inherited both, and understanding the difference between the clock as a tool and the clock as a master is something the history of timekeeping has been trying to tell us for 700 years. Mass-produced pocket watches, available to ordinary working people from the 1870s through American manufacturers applying factory methods to watchmaking, completed the privatization of time. Waltham and Elgin pioneered the interchangeable parts approach that brought watch prices within reach of industrial workers. The clock moved off the factory tower and onto the individual body. Every person now carried their own countdown wherever they went. Punctuality, arriving at the exact specified moment, became a moral virtue in industrial culture in a way it had never been before, because tardiness now had a measurable, contractual cost. Being late was no longer a social failing. It was a breach of economic contract. The wristwatch arrived from the trenches of the First World War. Soldiers synchronizing infantry advances with artillery barrages needed to check the time while keeping their bodies pressed against the mud of the trench. Raising a hand to check a pocket watch above the parapet invited a sniper's shot. The wristwatch solved this by moving the clock to the inside of the wrist, readable with a downward glance. Military procurement drove mass production. Returning soldiers wore their wristwatches home. Within a decade, the pocket watch had become obsolete. Time had relocated permanently onto the body. The atomic clock arrived in 1955, built by Louis Essen and Jack Perry at the National Physical Laboratory in England. Cesium-133 atoms oscillate at precisely 9,192,631,770 cycles per second, always, everywhere, unaffected by any external condition. The cesium atomic clock loses or gains 1 second every 300 million years. This precision serves no individual human purpose. It is required by GPS satellites, financial trading networks, global telecommunications systems, and internet protocols. Every digital transaction is time-stamped against atomic time without the user's knowledge. Modern civilization runs on it, invisibly, beneath everything. The paradox that ends this history is this: we have never measured time more precisely, and we have rarely felt more controlled by it. Research consistently finds that people in heavily clocked, digitally scheduled societies report more chronic time pressure and less sense of autonomy than any previous era's measurements recorded. The mechanical rooster in Strasbourg crowed in 1354, and a crowd gathered in wonder. 7 centuries later, the atomic clock governs every digital interaction on the planet, and the feeling it produces is not wonder, it is urgent. We built the perfect clock, then we let it keep score of everything. Time zones, once established, became instruments of economic and political power in their own right. When Japan modernized rapidly in the Meiji era after 1868, adopting a single national time zone was part of the modernization program, a declaration that the country was organizing itself on industrial rather than agricultural time. When China, a country spanning the equivalent of 5 natural time zones, declared a single national time in 1949, it was a political statement about national unity as much as a logistical decision. The clock, extended into the geography of nations, became a tool of political consolidation. The power that controlled the time controlled the schedule of an entire country's daily life. Sleep science has added a final chapter. Research into circadian rhythms, the natural biological clock that regulates human sleep, hormone production, metabolism, and attention across a 24-hour cycle, has established that the social clock imposed by standardized time conflicts with biological time for a significant portion of the population. Adolescents' circadian rhythms shift during puberty, making early morning alertness biologically difficult, a fact that early school start times enforce as a social norm regardless of their physiological cost. The mechanical clock, which replaced the sun as the authority on human time, now regularly overrides the body's own internal clock. The Strasbourg rooster crowed at a scheduled hour. The cesium atom counts to 9.2 billion per second. The human body has its own rhythm, and it has conflicted with the clock ever since the factory bell first rang. Next story, we'll uncover the hidden history of the key and how one small object became the ultimate symbol of trust, ownership, and power for more than 4,000 years. Because before anything could truly belong to you, someone had to invent the key.